Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Gurumurthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to remarkable people about their big ideas and the events in their lives that have helped shape them. My guest today is a man with lots of big ideas, and he's also a man who changes the world with them. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist based in Oxford, but he's perhaps most famous as the world's biggest atheist. His writing, his lectures argue the case for why God is a delusion, the name of one of his most famous books. And he's got a new one out at the moment, which is sort of a children's book based on the same ideas, and it's called Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide to Atheism. I normally end this podcast with a question, which is, if you could change the world, how would you change it? I think in your case, we should probably start with that, because I'm assuming you'd want to change the world by ridding us of religion altogether.
Well, I would, but I think I generalize that to anything that's not evidence-based where factual knowledge is concerned. So I would also like to rid the world of superstition of all kinds. And I mean, things
astrology
like
and
astrology and water divining and homeopathy and all sorts of things which are based on emotion and tradition, revelation, authority, rather than on evidence.
I mean, a lot of people would say you want to get rid of sort of anything that's based on feelings. You know.
Well, I'm very fond of feelings where art is concerned and music is concerned, poetry is concerned. I'm deeply moved by great art, great poetry, great music. And that's fine, that's feelings, but that's not about what's factually true. So things that might or might not be factually true, there we need evidence and evidence only.
Why do you think that would make the world a better place?
Well, for one thing, because facts are so wonderful and scientific facts are so beautiful and elegant and such a treat for everyone, children especially perhaps, to understand. So to deprive children of the great knowledge that science has provided, especially in the 21st century now, is a great tragedy for them. But also, of course, because if you base your beliefs upon anything other than evidence, then it's very hard to change your mind. And so people who have been brought up to believe that it's the righteous and good thing to do, to, kill apostates, bomb buildings and things, it's very hard to sway them because they've been taught from childhood, this is right, this is just, this is what your God wants you to do. And so if they're not trained, if they don't subscribe to the view that evidence is what matters, then how are you going to change their mind?
But are children really deprived of science? I mean, don't these two things go hand in hand to a large degree?
Well, maybe in this country largely, but certainly in America they don't. Certainly in America, education is being subverted by fundamentalist religion. And my own field is evolutionary biology, and that particularly is subverted in American education by religious interests, where they actually try to stop children learning about evolution. And
so, in terms of the way we behave with each other, why do you think the world would be better without these things? Because, I mean, you say, our actions should be evidence-based. I mean, aren't a lot of your explanations for why why religion is such a big thing in the world based on the idea that we don't always take the rational choice. We don't always do what is evidence-based. We often do things based on a sense of feeling.
Well, that's right, and that's what's so bad. I mean,
But that's not come from religion, has it? I mean, it's sort of a bit chicken and egg.
Oh, well, yes, if you mean that somehow the human brain is somehow susceptible to emotion rather than to evidence, that could well be true. And I would like to change that. I mean, I would like to enhance our natural tendency to go for religion and to reduce our natural tendency to go for emotion, where factual evidence, I keep stressing that because emotion is very, very important where things like art are concerned.
So is that why you do what you do? I mean, are you an evangelist, if you like?
Well, I suppose I'm an evangelist for truth, for scientific truth. Most of my books, I think only one of my books previously has been about religion. Most of my books have been about science. And I have a real passion for science. I have a real passion for science, not just because it's useful, though of course it is, but because it's beautiful.
And do you think all religion is equally bad?
No, of course not. I think all religion is probably equally misguided, but some religions are worse than others where their effect upon human behavior is concerned.
Is that why you said that you thought Islam was the greatest evil today a few years ago?
Yes. I think that's true. Only today, mind you. I mean, in medieval times, Christianity was, but Christianity has rather sort of grown out of that.
And do you still think Islam is the greatest evil today?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think that nationalism, patriotism, really, where you say my country right or wrong, America first, these are also great evils which we would be better off without.
Because, and we'll come back to that, of course, but I mean, in a way aren't we living in a world in which we are less and less evidence-based, less and less truth-based?
I hope
and
not.
more emotionally driven, more emotionally swayed, whether it's in politics or...
That's possibly true. I would hope it's a temporary trend. I think it might be true, and I think the internet might partly be responsible for that. I haven't really thought that through. Perhaps you have views on that. It could be said, yes, that there is a temporary blip in the more general trend towards being more evidence-based.
You were brought up as an Anglican. I mean, you were born abroad, weren't you?
Yes, but in a very British environment. And so, yes, I was brought up... Well, I was sent to Anglican schools.
So what was your childhood like?
It was a happy childhood. It was in Africa, colonial Africa, so it was a very cushy existence in many ways. We had servants and things like that. In other ways, it wasn't cushy. We didn't have water closets. We had earth closets, things like that. We had no electric light. But so it was rather a throwback, perhaps, to Victorian England in a way.
And who introduced the idea of God to you?
School.
Rather than parents?
Probably my parents sort of mentioned it in the same sort of breath as Little Red Riding Hood and things like that. And
do you remember believing?
Oh, yes. At school, I was confirmed into the Church of England.
And you meant it at the time?
Oh, yes. At the age of about 12 or 13.
And how do you think that happened? I mean, had you been indoctrinated? Or, I mean, what was it?
Indoctrinated is a strong word, but it had been a central part of my education at school, yes.
I mean, what I mean is, have you come to understand how you had come to believe in something?
Yes, when you're told something by an authority figure, by a teacher, by a vicar, yes, it's not...
You just accept it?
Yes, it's not difficult to understand why that is.
In a way it is, isn't it? I mean, to really believe is to really accept an idea in your mind, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Not just to repeat what you're being told.
No, I mean, I really believed it, and I think people do, and I think that's one of the insidious aspects of it, that the child mind is receptive, perhaps too receptive, but you can see why. It would be a good thing for the child mind to be receptive to whatever the child mind is told by an authoritative adult speaking very seriously. And it's easy to see why all over the world people inherit, not in a genetic sense, in a mimetic sense, inherit the religion of their parents, their grandparents, their school teachers, their priests, and so on. And they really, really do believe it, and that's important to understand. When we castigate terrorists for doing suicide bombings and things like that, you have to understand they really, really believe it. They really believe, as Sam Harris says, they really believe what they say they believe. And it's not surprising that they do, considering that they were taught it. It was rammed down their throats in early childhood.
I mean, you have very controversially before said that believers are victims of their religion.
Yes.
I mean, are you extending that then to terrorists?
Of course.
That they are victims.
Yes. Yes. They really believe it. They honestly, they're sincere. They believe that they're doing the righteous, good thing. And they've been taught that. They are victims, yes.
And so whose fault is that? What are they victims of?
Well, I suppose, I mean, it's tempting to say they're victims of their teachers and priests, but that's probably unfair too, because the teachers and priests themselves were victims in their own childhood. It's a self-repeating process. That's the whole point of mimetics. It just goes on from generation to generation. So perhaps we shouldn't use the word fault. I mean, it's just something that happens, just like genes get passed on. We can break the cycle by counter-education, and that's what I'm trying to do in my life.
Why did you stop believing then, as a child?
Oh, I stopped believing for various reasons. I mean, first of all, because I realized I think my mother woke me up to this, that there are lots of different religions and they're all incompatible, so they can't all be right. So why would you assume that the one you happen to have been brought up in is right? That was when I was about 9. But then I kind of reverted and got confirmed, and then I finally gave it up at the age of about 15 or 16 when I understood about Darwin, because I was left with a kind of residual deism, where I believed not in the particular Christian God, but in some kind of supernatural creator, some kind of creative intelligence. And I gave that up when I understood Darwin.
But why does Darwin extinguish, in your mind, the idea of an original creator?
Because the original creator was persuasive to me, because I was very inspired and impressed by the living world. And so when I saw a moth that looked exactly like the bark it's sitting on, when I saw a panther that's such an exquisitely designed hunter, when I saw an antelope that was exquisitely designed to escape from predators, everywhere you look in the living world, as I was doing, studying biology, it has apparent design written all over it. And it was only when I understood that Darwin had an alternative explanation, a much better explanation for apparent design. It isn't design at all. It's produced by the non-random process called Darwinian natural selection. Once I understood that, there was no longer any need for God. God became positively superfluous, unnecessary and superfluous.
I mean, that's what Outgrowing God does. It takes you through all of these notions that we have or are brought up with or are taught in one way or another about what the reasons for our beliefs might be, and tries to cross them out, if you like. But if you take your own experience, which was that Darwinism drew you away from believing in God, why didn't you end up in a situation where you thought, well, maybe God started it all off, and then Darwinism took over?
Yes, that's a good question. The reason for that is that Darwin solved the big problem. The apparent design of living creatures is the really big problem, and that was really compelling. Before Darwin came along, it was very difficult to be an atheist. The origin of everything, the idea that God just started it off, the idea that God sort of, so to speak, began the process of evolution and then sat back and did nothing. That's very unpersuasive, because having got rid of God for the big problem, which is the apparent design and diversity of living things, why would you smuggle him in for just a little problem right at the very beginning?
Is it a little problem, though, the beginning of everything?
Well, I think it's comparative, and this is controversial, and some people would say it's not a little problem. I think it's comparatively little. The thing about Darwinian evolution is that it starts from simplicity and builds up to this prodigious complexity that we see in the living world. Now, before that, the start of evolution, everything was simple. And it's much, much easier to say that simple things just happened than to say that complex things just happened. Complex, more or less by definition, cannot just happen. It has to have an explanation. Darwin provided that explanation. The origin in simplicity requires sort of an explanation, but it's nothing like such a big explanation. And physicists are now working towards understanding the explanation of the origin of the cosmos and the origin of everything.
Well, are they? I mean...
Yes.
Do you think we'll work it out in our lifetimes, where it all began?
I don't know about in our lifetime. I mean, I think it's...
Well, in 100 years, then.
The history of science gives us every encouragement. I mean, it one by one, the various problems have fallen to science.
I mean, that's a matter of faith, isn't it? I mean, you're sort of...
You could call it faith if you like, but I think it's a matter of historical precedent. It's a matter of the experience of science. If you think about what we now know compared to what our ancestors knew 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, it's a magnificent progress towards understanding everything. Maybe we won't ever understand everything, but the record shows that we're on the right path.
Do you think we would behave better without religion? Doesn't religion give us codes, rules by which to live?
Yes, and they're pretty awful, aren't they? If you think about the codes that are given us by the Bible, especially the Old Testament, obviously. I mean, anybody who lived their life according to the morality of the Old Testament would be an appalling person you would not wish to know. I mean, stoning people to death for breaking the Sabbath, stoning witches, persecuting homosexuals, and so on and so forth. The New Testament's a bit better. I mean, Jesus was obviously a very, very nice person, if he lived. I mean, either Jesus was a nice person, or whoever wrote his lines was a very nice person.
Quite rude to his mother.
Well, yes, but that, can perhaps overlook that. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount is classically regarded as a very, very wonderful set of rules for living, and indeed it is. But taken as a whole, the Bible is a terrible set of rules for living, and given that there are a few nice bits, you have then to have a criterion for which bits you decide are the nice bits, like the Sermon on the Mount. And the criterion by which we decide that has to be non-biblical, otherwise it's a circular argument. So we can look through the Bible and cherry-pick the bits that we regard as good, and we do that. But then why bother with the Bible at all? If we've got a criterion for cherry-picking, let's just use that criterion and live our lives by moral standards, which we are given by moral philosophers and by the general progress in morality, which we see as we look from century to century, decade to decade, actually. It's that quick.
But do you think people would live well if there was no sense of any ultimate sanction? No fear of hell, no fear of divine retribution?
Possibly not, and that's a rather pessimistic conclusion, because what that means is that the only reason people are being good is that they're frightened of hell. They're frightened of being found out. They're frightened of the great surveillance camera in the sky that's watching your every move.
Perhaps not the only reason, but perhaps an ultimate reason.
Well, that's a patronizing reason. What it's sort of saying is people are not good enough to just be good. They need to believe that there's a spy camera watching them. There's a divine policeman watching their every move.
That's an evidence-based argument, isn't it? But people are not very good.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say it is. Steve Pinker has an anecdote, a rather pessimistic anecdote, that in Toronto when he was a boy he had great sort of liberal ideals. And then there was a police strike in Toronto. And immediately lots of people went around smashing shop windows and pinching things and so on, which suggests you're right, that evidence-based, it is the pessimistic conclusion that people actually do need to be policed. But I don't find that a good reason to propagate a falsehood, as I believe it is. If you say, well, you and I are too intelligent to believe in God, but other people need it. What a patronizing, condescending attitude. Other people need it in order to be good. Why don't we try to foster goodness without the divine policeman?
Why do you think religion came about then?
Oh, well, that's another question. And you can answer that at a psychological level. You can say that our wild ancestors were faced with terror. They were faced with ignorance. They didn't understand why things happened. They didn't understand why the crops failed, why there were plagues, why there were terrible diseases, why there were droughts and famines. And so it was natural for them to attribute those things to some kind of agency. And that's a psychological explanation. Another one would be they're terrified of dying or terrified of not seeing their loved ones again after they've died, and so it's a good idea. Wishful thinking, in other words. So that would be a psychological explanation of how religion came about. I think there might be other explanations as well.
I mean, aren't all of these explanations still the case in a lot of places for a lot of people?
Oh, yes. I mean, the fact that we can provide an explanation for why religion exists does not mean it's true. And I care about what's true.
Well, I'm asking you whether it's a good or a bad thing as well, whether the world would be a bad... You want to change the world by ridding us of all, non-evidence-based thinking, as you see it. I'm asking you why you think that would make the world a better place.
Let me parse that a bit. What you're kind of suggesting by asking that question is that even if religion is false, even if there is no such thing as a god or gods, then it might be a good thing if people believe in that falsehood. And I don't go along with that. I mean, I can see that it might be a politically expedient thing to say it's good for people to believe in a falsehood because it makes them behave better or something of that sort. Maybe the world would be a better place politically, socially, if people believe this falsehood. I think that is patronizing and condescending, as I say. I think it's patronizing to suggest that although it's false, people need to believe in the falsehood in order to be moral, in order that the world should be a better place. I would rather stick to the truth.
I mean, I suppose the reason I'm putting that is because, you say although it is false very definitely. The truth is we don't know 100%
we don't know
whether it's true or
false.
No,
but there's a kind of premise that even if it is false, you're suggesting that it might be a good thing. I'm suggesting on my assumption that it's false, it wouldn't be a good thing. If it's true, that's another matter. I mean, if some evidence could be found that it's true, then I would completely change my mind.
I mean, I suppose what I'm getting at is in this world that doesn't have religion, that doesn't have fear of a creator, that doesn't have written rules by a God, how do we find a better way to live?
There are plenty of people who don't believe in that, who are actually very moral people.
But they've grown up in a world which was governed by codes that were created by religion.
You could say that. I'm not sure how much I buy that. That is a point that is often made, and it could be true. But there is the academic study of moral philosophy, which is very fruitful study, and philosophers down the ages have come up with moral principles which are not based upon supernatural beliefs, which are based upon sort of extensions of the golden rule, do unto others as you would wish them to do unto you, and things like that. And there are other more sophisticated examples of moral philosophy. Then it's perfectly clear that our moral and ethical criteria are changing anyway. We now no longer believe in slavery. 200 years ago, it was taken for granted. These things change as the decades go by. There's what I call the shifting moral zeitgeist. And that's clearly a phenomenon. That clearly happens. It's much more difficult to explain why it happens. And I've tried in Outgrowing God to give some explanation for why it happens. But it's a combination of moral philosophy, of parliamentary decisions, of legal decisions, of just plain conversations, just plain discussions, of journalism, broadcasting. All these things are conspiring together to change the moral outlook such that the moral outlook of a 21st century person is quite different from that of the moral outlook of somebody of 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago. These things change all the time. And even if there's some kind of foundation coming from religion, there's also a foundation coming from evolutionary biology, but these things change very rapidly so that it's no longer recognizable as a religious code or indeed as a Darwinian code. It's something that changes rapidly, dramatically actually, as the centuries and decades go by.
Do you believe in that progress always happens, is constant in the way we think?
It's controversial whether that happens in biology, and I'm on the sort of wing of those people who think that it does. Not all the time, but there's a general tendency for it to happen. And then there's historical evidence, which you'll find in Steven Pinker's wonderful book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Michael Shermer's book, The Moral Arc, to show that historically, over the long time, over centuries, over even millennia, yes, we're getting better. We don't do slavery anymore. We don't do torture anymore. Most of us, we don't enjoy spectator sport of public executions. In some places in the world they still go on, but in general, these things are all changing in the right direction, in a progressive direction. It's getting better.
Do you think you personally have always articulated this in the best way? I mean, you annoy people, don't you?
Yes. I think I annoy people more than they deserve to be annoyed. I don't think they should be annoyed quite as much as they are.
You don't mean to?
No. I mean to speak the truth, and I mean to be frank and open and honest. But some of the people who are annoyed because it upsets their deepest convictions, which are religious. And so I think they sometimes actually hear what is not a provocative way of putting things, it's just a straightforward way of putting things. They sometimes hear it as more aggressive and annoying than it really is.
Because, I was just looking, in your Twitter biography, you say you're a good-humoured ridicule, you do good-humoured ridicule of religions.
Yes.
Do you think it's always good-humoured?
Yes. I don't believe in ridiculing people. I believe in ridiculing their ridiculous beliefs. I'm fond of quoting Johann Hari's statement, something like, I respect you too much to respect your ridiculous beliefs.
What I wonder is, are you good-humoured towards Anglicanism and perhaps Hinduism and Judaism, but not very good-humoured towards Islam? You seem to hate Islam. Is that putting it too strongly?
Let me put it this way. I hate female genital mutilation. I hate executing apostates. I hate cutting people's hands off. I hate throwing homosexuals off high buildings. Those are all things that I hate.
I'm sure there are lots of things that have been done within Christianity that you would hate.
Of course there have,
well.
but
Yes.
that was in the Middle Ages, not anymore. I mean, Christianity is responsible for the most appalling things centuries ago. But as I said earlier, Christianity is largely, not entirely, grown out of that.
So for you, is it all about what those religions represent now, right, today as we speak in our world?
As I said,
rather than over the course of history. I mean, would you say that Islam is worse than Christianity over the course of history, or are they equally bad?
Probably equally bad if you integrate over the course of history. But now is what matters, and now Islam is worse. Yes.
Just explain why.
Oh, come on, I've just told you, throwing homosexuals off buildings.
But these are all sort of extreme minority things that you're describing. They're not normal lived Islam for 1.5 billion people, are they?
Well, no, they don't. 1.5 billion people don't do it.
No.
But nevertheless, they get Quranic and hadithic, if that's a word, authority for it.
But you're taking, surely, the behaviour of a tiny minority in the extreme and projecting that across a people in a religion.
It is a tiny minority, and I certainly do not wish to suggest for one moment that a majority of Muslims do that kind of thing. Of course they don't. But the doctrine to which they subscribe, which is Islam, sanctions that kind of thing.
And didn't Christianity?
Yes, but it...
So that's what I'm saying. When you say Islam is worse, that's what I'm struggling with. I mean, the religions have been used by people through the ages to do terrible things.
Have you looked at the polls?
Why do you think there's a hierarchy?
Have you looked at the polls of what individual Muslims think when they're actually asked, do you agree that apostates should be executed?
Well, we can argue about those polls. I know that a lot of those polls are quite controversial in terms of the questions they're asking and the poll size and all the rest of it. I suppose what I'm getting at is the way you communicate, and you're one of the most famous scientific communicators. Do you fear that you've clouded your message at all with those kinds of statements?
Possibly, but I'm not a politician. I'm a scientist, and I care about what's true. And so what I want to know, all my books are about scientific truth, including the God Delusion, actually, and including Outgrowing God. So what I care about is what's true. I'm not a politician who's trying to get elected. I'm not trying to be popular.
So does it bother you that you're regarded as an Islamophobe by many people? I mean, I know that's a word you don't really recognise.
Well, I hope you don't either. I mean, it's a ridiculous word. I've said countless times that Muslims, individual Muslims, are the primary victims of Islam.
Which is also a very controversial thing to say. I mean,
Maybe controversial, it's undeniable.
Well, it's undeniable that you're a victim of white middle-class colonial society in the same way. I mean, we're all victims of our upbringings and our cultural norms.
Yes, but I'm not persecuted.
Because there are bad. Well, arguably you are. It depends on your perspective, doesn't it?
I suppose, but I'm not threatened. I don't fear for my life because of the society in which I'm brought up. Whereas there are bloggers in Bangladesh, for example, who actually do fear for their life because they have done really, really quite innocent things, like say that they question some aspect of whether God exists, something of that sort.
Yes, I mean, I suppose
they are victims of Islam.
Yes, I mean things like your tweet about the niceness of the bells of a cathedral compared to the unpleasantness in your words of Allahu Akbar.
Let me say something about that. Allahu Akbar can sound beautiful and aesthetically wonderful when it's sung from a minaret by a beautiful voice.
As it generally is.
And I've heard that, and it is wonderful. What I meant by that, and Twitter is too short, tweets are too short to say that, is that Allahu Akbar is the last thing you hear before the bomb goes off. That's what I meant by saying that it has an aggressive ring to it.
I mean, again, isn't that a silly comparison, though?
No,
I mean,
it's true. It's literally true.
Well, but it's only literally true for a tiny, tiny number of people.
It's true for all the people who've been blown up by terrorist bombs.
Yes, but again, you're talking about, you're comparing church bells, which is your cultural norm, to your imagined experience of somebody being blown up, which is a tiny, tiny number of people within that.
Nobody has ever died as a consequence of hearing church bells, except for somebody Lord Peter
But
Wimsey
that's
novel.
yeah, I know. But what I mean is, it was a silly comparison, wasn't it? Because I mean, there were crusades. There were lots of people who'd been killed in the name of other religions, and they would have equally heard, I'm sure, religious phraseology.
Of course they
or
did, but that was
justification.
500 years ago. That's the point.
What's the point? That it doesn't happen today?
Yes. Church bells are, at worst, church bells are a nuisance to people who are trying to concentrate on the book they're reading.
But you did ask whether it gave away your own cultural
I did.
prejudice.
Yes.
Do you now see that it did?
Well, from an aesthetic point of view, I suppose that's right. But I could have added that aesthetically, I find the call to prayer very beautiful. I've heard it sung very, very beautifully in Morocco, for example, where it was a beautiful, deep, rather like Paul Robeson voice. And that was wonderful. I was woken up by it at dawn, and it was beautiful. So I can cope with that aesthetic as well. But the main point I was trying to make was, as I said before, it's the last thing you hear when the bomb goes off.
I mean, the point you make is right at the beginning of the book is that with all of these, the Greek gods and Roman gods and, the sun god and all of these things, that's now normal to dismiss all of that and say, well, of course those gods don't exist. But God, the Christian God, the Jewish God, well, there's got to be something there. Maybe it's all just one God and we all share it out between different religions, but there must be something there. Why do you think we're able to make that distinction between these archaic gods and the notion of God that we have now?
Because we, when you say we, you, I mean one.
Society
is brought up to believe in the God of the Jews and not in the God of the Greeks and the Vikings.
It's indoctrination then. It's just
I mean,
taught.
if Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, hadn't adopted Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, children in Europe today would probably all worshipping Jupiter and Hera and Neptune.
And what do you think happens when we die?
Well, either we're cremated or we're buried, or we leave our body to science.
Do you fear it at all?
I fear the process of dying, depending upon how it happens. And I think that, unlike non-human animals who have the privilege of going to the vet and being put to sleep, we don't have that privilege. And so the likelihood is that our process of dying is not going to be very pleasant.
People often become more religious or more superstitious as they get older, though, don't they? Because they fear the Creator, or either being judged or that there's nothing.
I believe
that they just stop.
Could well be true. An Australian friend of mine said, "Why are there so many old people in church cramming for the final?"
But you've never found yourself wondering. Have you ever had doubts that you may be wrong?
Not since I became an atheist, no. I mean, I may have doubts about lots of other things, but not about my individuality surviving the death of my brain. Of course not. That would be absurd.
And it's never sort of occurred to you that there may be a dimension, a way of thinking that you're just not capable of, that exists?
I believe that's true, probably. And I think that, for example, if ever we get into contact with extraterrestrial aliens, they will be a lot more advanced than we are, probably, because otherwise they couldn't get here. They couldn't. And we'll have a lot to learn from them. And so there will be some things that will simply blow our minds.
So you think it is likely that there are other living creatures out there somewhere?
Yes, I do.
Just on the balance of probability?
Yes, statistical grounds. I mean, the sheer number of stars, and therefore we now know that most stars have planets. And so I think the probabilities suggest that there are probably lots of other civilizations. Of course, it's arguable that they won't get much more advanced than we are, because there's a tendency for civilizations to destroy themselves. And so maybe all over the universe there may be little pockets of civilization winking into existence and then extinguishing themselves. That's a speculation, a science fiction speculation. It is possible that we are unique, and I have considered that at the end of The Blind Watchmaker, one of my books. It's not totally obvious that there have to be other living creatures around. But if we are unique, then what that means is that there's something very, 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 very special about the origin of life on this planet. If we are the only one that's developed life, then the origin of life would then have to be a quite stupendously improbable event, so much so that we're wasting our time trying to understand it. But I don't believe that, as a matter of fact. I believe that there is probably quite a lot of life around the universe. Even if there's only say, as few as 1 billion other life forms. And I stress that word few because 1 billion is a tiny, tiny number compared to the 10 to the 22. If that were the case, then the different life forms might be so widely spaced out that none of them ever encounters any of the others.
Other eminent scientists, Stephen Hawking, Einstein, I suppose have had this notion that sort of, God might just be that bit of science that we haven't quite.
Oh, well, that's just a matter of terminology. Einstein and Hawking both used God language, but what they meant by that was that which we don't know, that which we don't understand. And they had a reverence. Einstein especially had a deep reverence for that which we don't understand. He unfortunately chose to couch it in God language, which has given a lot of people the mistaken impression that he was a believer in some kind of personal God, and he was very adamant, actually, that he was not. He did not believe in a personal God.
So you think that's a mistake, to sort of just go along with that notion? Give it that God-like language. I mean, Hawking's done the same, hasn't he?
Well, yes. I mean, he ended up famously the last words of A Brief History of Time, for then we should know the mind of God. But Hawking was definitely an atheist, so was Einstein. Einstein used God language much more often. He said things like, but he does not play dice, meaning, but God does not play dice. And he said, what I really want to know is, did God have a choice in designing the universe? What he meant was, is there more than one way for a universe to be? And that's an interesting question. Could there be more than one kind of universe, or is there only one possible way? But he chose to put that in God language, a sort of poetic language, really, which has been widely misunderstood by people eager to misunderstand, I might add.
So if we were to actually sort of follow you, suppose the government said, OK, let's do what Richard Dawkins wants, what would it involve?
It would not involve dictatorial indoctrination in atheism. It would involve instead education in skeptical ways of thinking, in evidence-based thinking, teaching people how to think, not teaching people what to think, to coin that rather hackneyed phrase.
What does that mean? I mean, what is it that we're learning wrong, or how are we learning wrong?
We are learning wrong insofar as we tell children, this is your religion, this is what you believe, this is what you should believe. You should believe in Yahweh, you should believe in Apollo, you should believe in Thor, which throughout the ages children have been taught. That's not what you should teach children.
But most state schools today don't do that.
That's true. They don't do that, but there are quite a number of faith-based schools, faith schools so-called, which do that.
So you'd get rid of all of those?
I wouldn't get rid of the schools. I would get rid of the teaching children a particular faith. I think it's very important to teach children that religion exists. You need to teach children about different religions. You can't understand European history, indeed world history, unless you understand about religion, because so many of the world's wars have been fought on the basis of religious.
But should it be taught as something that's wrong?
It should be taught as something that happens, something that is historically there. The Bible should be taught as literature because so much of English literature contains allusions to the Bible, and you can't get away from that. In the God Delusion, I think I've got about 3 pages of phrases which are part of English language, part of proverbial language, which come directly from the Bible. You can't understand Shakespeare, you can't understand so much of literature unless you're steeped in the Bible, and no doubt you can't understand Arabic literature unless you're steeped in the Quran. No, you can't understand Indian literature unless you're steeped in the Bhagavad Gita and so on. So yes, we need to study religious books as literature and as history.
Whether it is or not, in terms of the history.
Yes. Yeah. But not as science, and that's not as science, and not as labeling children with the religion of their parents. Not saying you are a Christian child, or you are a Muslim child. It would make a hell of a difference in the Islamic world and in America, actually, where religion does still have a very powerful hold on people's minds because it has a powerful hold on child minds.
And it's particularly odd in America, isn't it? Because nobody really thinks Trump, for example, is a religious man.
No.
And yet he's moving much more in a faith-based direction, certainly on something like abortion.
That's right. Well, abortion is such a tremendous hot-button issue in America to a large section of the community. And so anybody who says he's against abortion only then has to pretend to be religious in order to get away with it. Religion does have an anomalously high hold on the American mind. It does stand out like a sore thumb when you compare it with other countries of similar economic status. There's a known relationship between religiosity and poverty and lack of social welfare. Those countries and those states within America that have more of a social safety net, health schemes and that kind of thing, they are the least religious. Religion tends to flourish in those countries where people feel insecure, either because of poverty or because of lack of social welfare provision. And America does stand out as being an anomaly on that graph.
And why do you think that is?
Very difficult to say. There have been various theories advanced. One is that in Western Europe, where there is an established religion, as in Britain and Scandinavia, religion becomes sort of boring. It becomes, you encounter it when you get married and when you die, but otherwise it's sort of not taken seriously. Whereas in America, religion is big business. You get these gigantic mega churches with evangelists using the slick Madison Avenue type techniques to sell their particular church as opposed to rival churches. So it's exciting. And you have these people waving their arms around and dancing in the aisles and things, and religion is a form of entertainment. And that's one theory. Another theory is that religion is that America, being an immigrant society, just about everybody is descended from immigrant parents, and not that long ago immigrant parents, all except for Native Americans. And one of the things that happens when you go across the Atlantic to a strange country is that you feel lonely, you feel isolated, you've left your roots behind, you've left your family behind. And so religion gives you, a church gives you a feeling of security, gives you a kind of substitute family. That's another theory that's been advanced.
When you think about what's going on in America, in parts of the Muslim world, when you look at the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, I mean, do you think you're losing this argument, your side?
Only temporarily. I mean, I think that there's a temporary reversal, as I said before. I mean, we're losing the argument in America because of Trump. Let's hope he doesn't get re-elected. And Hindu nationalism, you're right. I mean, Gandhi and Nehru would be turning in their graves as what's going on in India. The rise of militant Islam as a form of pride, really, as a kind of nationalism, which I think is another great evil. I mean, the great wars of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, were nationalistic wars. So that's another ideology which is not evidence-based and has evil consequences.
But is it because secularism has failed these people? You know, rational thought hasn't got them anywhere?
I doubt that. As I say, I think it's a temporary thing. There's no doubt we're in a bad patch just at the moment.
Do you think we will get to a point where the idea of God will just be a sort of a curiosity?
We're moving in that direction over the long term, but we've got a long way to go, and I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as to when that will happen.
So do you think we will outgrow God?
It might take centuries, but yes.
So how do you think we will look back on religion if we do ever outgrow God?
The same kind of way we look back on when we believe that witches should be burned, that sort of thing. We'll look back on it as a dark period.
Richard Dawkins, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for sharing
very
your
much.
ways to change the world.